Excelentíssimas senhoras e senhores, encarrega-me o Presidente do Conselho de Curadores da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, também meu pai, de vos saudar calorosamente nesta data especial em que prestamos uma justa e merecida homenagem ao professor António Borges. E fazemos-lo, julgamos nós, da forma que o professor António Borges teria preferido, no Porto, que é a sua cidade natal, e no final de uma ativa jornada de trabalho sobre a economia e a competitividade, com uma palestra que leva o seu nome e que se estreia com reflexões sobre estratégia e competitividade nesta era digital. Economista brilhante, dos mais brilhantes, e desassombrado cívica e politicamente comprometido, o professor António Borges influenciou várias gerações de estudantes das mais reputadas escolas de Economia e Gestão, alcançou reconhecimento e prestígio nacionais e internacionais e reforçou o respeito do mundo por Portugal. Foi um homem do pensamento e da ação, um académico excepcional que nunca se isolou da sociedade, nem se escusou a dar o seu contributo para a superação dos desafios que, a cada momento, se lhe foram colocando. O professor António Borges foi uma personalidade marcante da vida pública portuguesa, que se distinguiu pela inteligência fulgurante, a firmeza das suas convicções e a coragem com que as defendia. Mais de 5 anos passados sobre o seu desaparecimento, esta homenagem é também uma forma de não esquecer e de estimular a visão pela qual trabalhou sempre de um Portugal mais desenvolvido e mais próspero para os portugueses. Finalmente, e talvez acima de tudo, isto é um gesto de gratidão ao administrador excepcionalmente competente e íntegro, ao conselheiro prudente e sábio, ao amigo leal que ao longo de vários anos contribuiu decisivamente para melhores decisões e para o crescimento e o êxito do Grupo João Martins, que emprega hoje mais de 100 mil pessoas. À família do professor António Borges, aqui representada pela doutora Isabel Borges e seus filhos, dirijo uma saudação muito especial e grata por tudo que o professor António Borges nos deu e pelo tempo na sua companhia, de que ele certamente vos privou muitas vezes, pelo seu sentido de dever, de serviço e de responsabilidade verdadeiramente exemplar. Cumprimento também os amigos e admiradores do professor António Borges que se juntam a esta homenagem e, naturalmente, todos os presentes, a quem, em nome do meu pai e da nossa família, desejo uma ótima sessão. Muito obrigado. Sr. Professor Diogo Sena, o palco é seu.
Devo falar em português ou em inglês? Disseram-me que era em inglês. Há uns dias recebi um e-mail que me dizia que eu devia falar em inglês, de maneira que eu preparei a minha pequena intervenção em inglês, até por educação com o professor Peter Zemsky. I would like to start by saying that it's a big pleasure for me to be here. António Borges was a very remarkable person, and I'm not going to remake the eulogy that we just heard, but he was, above all for me, a very good friend, one of my best friends. So I could not but make my best effort to be here today. The Fundação actually talked to me almost a year ago, saying that they had the idea of doing something to remember António. Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to help very much, but when I was invited to be here, that was one more reason for not being able to say no. I think António Borges was, in fact, a rare combination of intellectual power and decision-making ability. I saw people with any of those as good as him, probably, but not together. And I think he was, in that sense, a very exceptional person. My main task today is to present Peter Zemsky. And I understood he was hired as a faculty member of INSEAD in 1904, when António Borges was dean. And I understood from small talk before that he became a very good friend. Professor Zemsky got his BA at the University of Pennsylvania, summa cum laude, which means his best student, basically. And PhD at Stanford from the Graduate School of Business. And for those who know, he was supported by a Natural Science Foundation, which is something very prestigious in the United States. He made his academic career at INSEAD, visiting 1 year at Wharton School. And he's now professor of strategy and holds the Eli Lilly Chair of Strategy and Innovation. He has been publishing in the best journals, academic journals, like American Economic Review, Rand Journal, Management Science, Strategy Management Journal. And he will, and he will have, I'm sorry, I jumped one page. He had, I think his role can be measured, in one way I like very much to measure academic impact is by how many PhD students will become famous. And I think he has a remarkable descendancy in that sense. A few of his graduate students won several prizes and are placed in very best universities. So I think we can say that he made some intellectual school, which is, after all, the ultimate judgment for an academic career. He presents himself as a passionate educator. And I liked very much the idea. He has an online executive education course, Strategy of an Age of Digital Disruption, which is extremely popular. And he led the development of large-scale customized courses for leading companies. And these courses received awards and were widely recognized as very good. And he is now deputy dean at INSEAD, and because of that, he has responsible for external relations, including fundraising, alumni relations, and communication. And he's also dean for innovation, which makes him responsible for the school's digital strategy, including the online courses. Peter Zemsky will give us a lecture stressing the disruptive prospects of the digital technologies. And I think the best way to describe his lecture is to read the questions he proposes to us. And I'm going to read 4 or 5 lines of his description. Why the surge of interest digital over the last few years? Is it helpful to view ourselves as living through a digital industrial revolution? Why is this an age of strategy? To what extent are the principles and practice of strategy changing? Why the emphasis on strategic agility today, and what are the limits? What are the implications, not only for the competitiveness of firms, but also of nations? And he'll have particular focus on the recent surge in interest in investment in machine learning. I think it's very natural that he gives this emphasis to strategy competitiveness. After all, he's professor of strategy. But maybe anticipating what I should do after, I would like to say a few things about the topic, a very short thing about the topic. I must say I'm very optimistic about the impact of technology progress. If you like to read history, you don't find any case where a revolution, a technological revolution, led in the long run to worse conditions of life. I usually say to my students, think about 1900s. 1900, 75% of the population was working in agriculture. Now we have 5%. And we don't have 70% of unemployment. What we have is that people are doing machine learning and things like that. And that's why we are richer, not why we are poorer. So in the long run, I'm completely optimistic. Now, we must recognize that we have adjustment costs in the short run. Some people are left behind. Some lose their employment. But I think the question we must ask ourselves is how can we minimize those costs? And so that brings a lot of issues to the forefront. And as I said, I'm a little bit anticipating my questions, is that shouldn't this lead to maybe to change in labor laws, the way we design the welfare state to help those people who are left behind and have no choice, rather than live with misery and then maybe lots of people against this digital revolution, which is ultimately very good for us. The other issue is regulation. When I was a student regulation was the classic thing about price. We have to control price. Now, if price is zero, there's no point in that. But lots of issues arise. One is a dynamic issue which has to do with the speed of the technology advance. And I think Bill Gates would like this argument, so that if you leave him alone with a monopoly, he will make research and development which are faster than in a competitive setting. And then in 10 years, consumers will be better off. I doubt very much this argument, but there is a tension here that didn't exist in our classical way of looking at things. How does the market structure affects the speed of development of new ideas? And the other one is the questions of control of information. Everybody talks about that now, so I'm not going to I mean, my information is what Facebook gets, and that's how they make money out of me. How much control should I have? Can they have? How should this be regulated? And the third one is moral issues, which are quite new. If we have a drone that can kill people, can we let him decide at what time? And if we have cars that kill people in the road by accident, who is morally responsible? The owner, the programmer? I think there are quite a lot of issues which are not only strategic, but are very much have much to do with how do we control the environment where all this action takes place. So, Peter, please.
Thank you. Okay, so indeed, it's a really big honor and pleasure of mine to be here for this Borges lecture. As you said, Antonio hired me as a young, geeky game theorist coming out of Stanford in 1994. And I think what he was looking for was early in the period when he was changing the culture at INSEAD and really beefing up our research abilities. And I was looking for two things. One was a place that would nurture me as a young scholar, but also I had a dream, which was to move from just being an economist to applying that kind of knowledge and expertise to understanding strategy and what was happening at the world. And INSEAD, as you'll see, has been a great platform for me for that. So I'm just internally grateful, both for hiring me, but also for the school that he helped to fashion. One of the things that I took away from my time at Stanford was sort of a deep interest in how does technology change impact an industry, and then what does that mean, particularly at the company level, for their strategy and their organization. And so the last few years, as you said, with all of this technology change, I feel a little bit like a kid in a candy shop because there's all these issues on people's minds, and especially being part of the leadership team at INSEAD now, I have an opportunity to talk to lots of different people and really try and make sense of what's happening out there. And what I really want to do in this lecture is not give you sort of my narrow academic research, but sort of how me as someone trained in economics, in social science, is trying in real time to make sense of what's happening out there and help leaders think through this. The last thing I'd just say about myself is 20 years after Antonio hired me, by 2014, I was already part of the leadership team at INSEAD. And of course, it's great that technology is changing everybody else's business and you can go out there and advise them. It's much more difficult when you have to deal with changes to your business. And as you mentioned, the online courses, one of my challenges has been how to, as a leader responsible for innovation at a school, how do you actually change the culture and the capabilities of an existing organization? And so this is just a last introduction of myself. Here's my Trump moment. So I don't know if you've picked up, but I'm originally from the US. I'm now US and French, I do want to say that. But here's my Trump moment. So without going into all the details, we were deciding how to build capabilities around these online courses. And for a variety of reasons, I decided not to go with Coursera and MOOCs, partly because this idea of giving away your customer relationship to something like Coursera, the way the music industry did, say, to iTunes, didn't make a lot of sense. But what we still needed to do was build capability, so we ended up developing online courses for big corporate clients. And the first corporate client we worked with was Microsoft, and ended up building a bunch of the solution myself. And so I ended up training online 8,000 client executives for Microsoft. And in terms of, this will sort of give a flavor of the excitement of digital. So I do that, and then say, oh, why don't you come to our big sales conference? Because as much as online is effective, people are still hungry for personal connection. And the people wanted to meet me and have a little talk, and then maybe get their paper certificate. So I said, oh, I was really enthused. I said, that's great. And then I started to think, I'm not going to stand there and give away 8,000 pieces of paper. So I said, I'll come and do that for an hour, but then what are we going to do? And they said, send us a photo. So I sent them a photo, and when I got down there after my hour of giving away certificates, they brought this out. So this is my Trump moment, as people came and got a picture with my cardboard cutout. Anyway, so I just say, my orientation, I am like you, super optimistic, love technology, totally understand the stresses it's creating on society. But fundamentally, my orientation is, how do we manage that so we can get both the economic benefits, but also just the fun of creating new things, new products, new experiences. All right, so let's dive in. So one thing you definitely see in digital is these waves of hype. So here I've got the takeoff in the last few years. This is Google search trends around machine learning. But we've had waves. It was 3D printing, sharing economy, mobile, cloud, blockchain. So you have these waves of reality or hype coming at you. The media loves to pick up on this. I think especially with AI, because they can dangle in front of you the threat that not just music industry is going to be disrupted, because that gets old. Now the media can say, ooh, all of humanity is being disrupted. And so you want to somehow find a way, and that's what I do a lot with leaders, is try and figure out, okay, what's the hype and what's the reality? So it is amazing for me. So someone who's been interested in the computing industry since the 90s, so computing's been around for a long time, having interesting effects, but for sure, in the last 3-4 years, it's been striking how digital has shot up the agenda of certainly corporate leaders. So for sure, CEOs increasingly, this is what they like to talk about. Even one of our alums, sort of out of a business career, became the finance minister of Canada. And I had a lunch with him after his first year, and I asked him, what surprised you about being finance minister? And one of the things is the amount of time the finance ministers, this was a little over a year ago, the amount of time we spent as finance ministers talking about AI and job loss. So that was sort of interesting. It's just out there. Now, one of the things I see the role of academics is to try and help people think through the hype versus the reality. And one thing this reminds me of, and again, is the whole thing around emerging markets and BRICS 10, 15 years ago, right? And same thing. There was an incredible overexposure hype around emerging markets and BRICS. And it was the same thing. Every multinational leader had to have their emerging market strategy. And again, some of them rushing in to invest in places like South Africa or Brazil, or even in China in some ways, did not get returns. So there was certainly a lot of hype and missed investments. On the other hand, obviously, there was something fundamental going on. Obviously, hundreds of millions of people moving into the middle classes. And again, for sure, those companies in the right place, say automotive in China, like Volkswagen, with the right strategies, did amazingly. And my view is we have exactly the similar thing happening today in digital. Yes, tons of hype. Yes, you can look at companies doing things that are going to look foolish in a few years, but absolutely there's a fundamental there. So as you said, one of my questions to throw out there that I ask, should we think about this on par with the classic industrial revolutions that we saw 120, 140 years ago? So I'm going to argue, yeah, I think that's a good metaphor or a good connection. We don't know what the economic historians will say in 50 years, but I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that they will talk about this as a digital industrial revolution. Of course, what do we know? Industrial revolutions tend to be about general purpose technology, whether it's electricity or about mass production. I think one of the key things to think about these industrial revolutions, of course, is as cost shocks, right? So electricity, if you think before that, all the power for the economy basically came from muscles, whether it was human or animals. Suddenly, that got a lot cheaper. And then similarly, the producing goods got cheaper. So what about digital? Okay, how many people are engineers by training? Little audience, yeah, a few, right? So if I'm talking to the engineers, we would talk about Moore's Law, right? And we would talk about what's driven this revolution is just these phenomenal advances in the number of microprocessors. This is in log scale, a bunch of mostly Intel processors, how many microprocessors you have on a chip, doubling roughly every 2 years. Maybe it's going to stop now, but I don't care. If you double something every 2 years for 40 years, you don't need to be an engineer to know that's a big deal. However, I'm not actually an engineer. As I told you, I'm more of an economist, interested in strategy. What matters is not the raw capability, but the cost of capabilities. So for me, and again, what we said about industrial revolutions, at their root, they're cost shocks. So this is the cost of 1 million microprocessors. So when I was at Stanford in the early 90s, we were all excited about PCs and talking about their impact. But just remember, 1 million microprocessors would cost around $500. Today, it's pennies, right? And it's not just processing information, it's storing it. This is the cost per gigabyte of storage. Why is it that Instagram stores every photo you could ever do, or YouTube every video? Is it because our stuff is so good? Are they like running out and going to say, oh, let's see what they've uploaded now? No, it's obviously because it's so cheap that as long as you have some loose revenue tied to that, you can make that work. And then the last one is not as dramatic, but still pretty dramatic. This is the cost of communication. But again, so the argument around why you could think about this as an industrial revolution is, this is the cost of storing, communicating, and manipulating information has fallen dramatically. And I think that's as important as the fall of power particularly. If you buy that, though, I think there's certain lessons you can draw from history. I think people, especially with digital, jump and try and think, oh, everything's so new. Well, as we know, at some level, yes, everything's new. But usually in social sciences, the underlying principles have a certain continuity. And so let's take a look. One thing to realize about industrial revolutions is they don't happen overnight. It takes time to adjust an economy, people, education, businesses to get the value out of that cost shock. So some data just showing the productivity in a way of US workers. This is how many hours you had to work in the US in a factory to buy a 3-pound chicken. And so that says, 1900, at the beginning of this, you had to work 3 hours. You were not serving chicken that often to your family. And over time, through all these innovations, both in agriculture and in factories and elsewhere, productivity goes up and it gets down to a half hour, but it takes decades, right? And I think that's important. Again, we do see, and people love to tell you about the examples where digital behavior changes like that, right? 1 year, we're all sending texts. 2 years later, it's WhatsApp. Sure, sometimes. But if you go in and look at a lot of sectors, education, health, government, it's a lot slower. So I think that's important to remind people of. Why? Because the set of changes you need is incredibly broad. One thing people talk a lot about today is innovation. We all like to talk about the cool new products. Again, imagine you were living, though, 100 years ago. There were cool new products as well, right? So people, this is, state-of-the-art washing your clothes. Some businesses, entrepreneurs, researchers had to figure out, hey, there's this product which is the, electric washing machine. And then, of course, once you have that as a product in the market, it can continuously improve. So product innovation is a big deal, but that's not all, right? We know the Industrial Revolution required huge shifts in infrastructure, railroads, communication, telegraph, then telephone. Assume you know about that, but also institutions. I think in some of your comments, you mentioned some of the institutional changes we're going to need around, say, the welfare state, labor laws, other laws. Same thing was true in earlier industrial revolutions, right? If you think about, say, the rise of financial markets, really, when you get mass production, you get increasingly these big companies, national, multinational, huge needs for investment and capital. Financial markets need to grow. Antitrust, right? Just like today, we have big antitrust issues. Surprise, surprise, back then, they also had big antitrust issues. And part of the institutional shifts were putting in place antitrust laws that worked then. Not clear that those antitrust laws still work, but that's another topic. One more, just since I'm at a business school. Where did business schools come from? If you think of the original sort of MBA degree was Tuck. You had Kellogg, Harvard. They all start when? Basically, Tuck is the first MBA, 1900. So business schools are an institutional innovation to complement sort of the Industrial Revolution, right? Suddenly, you have a lot of big businesses. You can no longer just rely on family members to run it. You need, ideally, a whole cadre of professional managers. And that's the origin of business schools. And again, I emphasize, this is probably important for competitiveness, I emphasize US examples, partly, I guess, because I grew up in the US, but also, right, it was really the US taking the lead in embracing the Industrial Revolution around this time that led it into its sort of position as a leading global economy. And it's exactly what you see the Chinese trying to do now, which is, can they embrace better digital and a whole set of technologies to move themselves into that leading position? And that's partly what's triggering the current potential outbreak of a long-term economic war between these two entities. So very interesting. Okay, so what's the analogies in terms of today? Again, infrastructure is different. It's not railroads. But why now? I think the fact that all of these capabilities, the storage, the speed, has been packaged up into the cloud is a big deal, right? I see this in terms of all the entrepreneurial activity. What does this mean? With all this change, there's obviously a huge opportunity to create new businesses, right? And most places are trying to think, how can we have an entrepreneurial ecosystem? The cloud is a big part of it because, of course, so much of the opportunity today is in software. If you're going to launch some new software-based business, a barrier to entry would usually be having the hardware, having an IT department. But with the cloud, you don't need any of that, right? You've got to have great software, but you call up AWS, Amazon Web Services, or Google, or Azure, and you can get all of the hardware you need, little bit of it. If you're lucky, if you're one of those startups that's got an amazing idea, you can get 10, 100, 1,000 times the size of your IT department almost with a phone call. So that's like a huge, huge leveling of the field. And not only that, but a lot of big traditional companies that I see, not only now do they face this level playing field at a key barrier to entry, but they have like traditional IT departments that are actually not cost competitive with this. And so they actually have what used to be a strength become a liability. Something that started out as, I guess, a product innovation would be obviously our friendly smartphone. But of course, this becomes, I would say, part of the infrastructure. right? The fact is, suddenly all of us are walking around with all that processing power, with kind of connection to the cloud. And so, the age we live in, people use this metaphor of Uberization. It's overused, but it's correct. Now, I can tell you, if I'd walked in to a classroom with smartest MBAs and I had said, oh, got a great idea, let's talk about how we're going to transform the process of calling a taxi. And let's see if we can create a multi-billion-dollar business out of calling taxis. I think there would have been silence. And yet, we live in a world where there were, yes, billions of dollars of at least business value at multiple companies in that kind of innovation. So a huge amount of product innovation. What about institutions? Clearly, a lot of work. I mean, Uber's a great example, right? Uber consciously challenging the regulation of transportation, often in not so constructive ways. GDPR, example of trying to adapt institutions. I think the biggest one is probably what you say. How is it that people are going to get their income 30 or 40 years from now? I think if you think that everybody is just going to go to the market and bring their labor services, maybe, but I wouldn't be so sure. And there's some huge adaptations coming there. I think you're going to see huge challenges in the US, or at least Europe is relatively better positioned in terms of having a tradition of a safety net. One of the issues in the US could be that, again, there's not that tradition. The anxiety levels are super high. In a downturn, they'll get higher, and that's partly what fuels potentially things like the current politics in the US. So big institutions. All right, so there you go. So we can talk about it when we get to questions, but I do see this potentially on the same order of magnitude, at least over decades, as what we've seen in the past, and I see those metaphors as useful. In terms of just though, I mean, as much as the fundamentals are there, as I said, there is a lot of hype. So when I take like machine learning, AI, one of the things I find useful, I guess still being an economist, is to look at not what the journalists, or no offense to journalists, very important institution, please don't go away, we need you, but at the same time, when I look at trying to cut through some of the hype, I do like to look at where are smart, knowledgeable people investing. And in digital today, right, the smartest, most informed people are typically sucked up by the big tech companies, right? And so this here, for example, shows the acquisitions by big tech companies in the US of machine learning AI startups. Just as one aside, I'm a huge believer that, again, when they write the history of this digital era, there will be a nice chapter on Steve Jobs. Lots of influential pieces that we take for granted that he's shifted. But just to point out that, I don't know, do you guys remember when Siri was acquired by Apple? And we all kind of laughed when Siri first came out. It was way too soon. But I would just point out that that was the last strategic move by Steve Jobs. So he did sign off on that deal. And again, it was a few years early, but it really tells where things have gone. So that's big tech. Also, this is looking at venture capitalists. As you probably know, there's been a huge surge of investment in machine learning. So this, again, venture capitalists can be wrong, but still, they're thinking pretty hard. They're trying to decide which sectors to go after. The green is all the early stage, a few 100,000. The blues are later rounds. And what you see in the last few years, this is the total, and this is like, you probably can't see that, but that's going up past 500 startups a year. This is showing you investment in those companies going up to close to 5 billion last year. And again, it's mostly coming in the later stage as the most successful of the seed funding are scaled up, as usual. But yet, we do see the venture capitalists scaling up. And of course, the other one, and the reason why there's a lot of momentum by there, is this is definitely becoming part of the rivalry, economic and frankly, probably military, between the US and China. The blue is US venture capital, and the red is Chinese. Again, it's partly they see it as strategic, but also if you know about machine learning, it's all about data and talent. But it's mostly about data. Chinese are in a great position. They have a ton of data. They've just digitalized a lot of their economy in terms of e-commerce, in terms of social media, so they're riding that, and they don't have some of the complications of GDPR. Don't ask me about that, but I guess you could. I'm going to start shifting to strategy a little bit. So why are the big tech companies going in so heavy so early? I mean, I showed the acquisitions, but it's not just the acquisitions. They're paying a ton of money for talent. They're just investing across the board. And again, the idea is going to be twofold. One is, yes, machine learning's had breakthroughs. If you've probably seen some of the use of neural networks is amazing. Yes, it rides on top of all the data that we have today. You know, in a way, there was this hype around big data a few years ago. Everyone talked about big data. And again, the problem was, yes, you had a ton of data, but humans you just stared at all that data and you couldn't get insights out. And so in a way, not more than a way, machine learning is the key complement for the big data. And it's a way to take well-structured digital data and actually extract insights from it. But the reason I think the big tech companies have gone in so heavy is they are experts at finding natural monopolies, right? All of them sit on some sort of very aggressive, one or more very aggressive positive feedbacks. They're always looking for that. And I think clearly their logic is they're seeing that here, so let's go through it. Again, the more customers you have as an enterprise, especially a digital enterprise, the more data you're spinning off, right? Everything you do on Facebook, everything you do on Amazon, it's all digitalized, right? And so they're sitting on amazing amounts of data, all integrated, well labeled. That's exactly what you need for machine learning, right? It's exactly that. You need the data and the outcomes, right? You clicked, and then you bought. And so anyway, all that machine learning, we'll talk about that, allows you to have products that create more value, to innovate. You bring that value creation to market. You have more customers. It's a classic positive feedback. And again, this is not overall. This is application by application. This is why you see Google, Home, Amazon Echo competing like crazy. This is the kind of early competition you have in a winner-take-all market where you're going to see where it tips and who has the $500 billion franchise 5 years from now. These kind of positive feedback. I would say it's not just the data. The other thing that's devastating is also you need talent. There is, if you dig into it, there is an art still in how you structure the algorithms, the neural networks, or whatever you're using to actually get the insights. For a while, there's going to be a scarcity of that talent. Basically, obviously, the big tech companies, they have the money, but also the data, right? These are a lot of the best talent, also are researchers. They're looking for settings where they can do the best work. And again, if I'm at Alibaba or Facebook or Amazon, I can offer you the most amazing data sets. Again, they suck up, they were already doing this, they suck up the talent, and it just makes it creates a huge barrier to entry. Again, another positive feedback. So again, one thing just as a strategy professor, one thing I reflect on is, to what extent does all this digital stuff actually change what we teach and to some extent research in strategy? And I try and keep, obviously I'm going to be biased because I've spent decades teaching and thinking in a certain way. So I try to be open-minded and think, okay, has something fundamentally changed? I push myself constantly to take sort of the frameworks, the way of thinking, and apply them to whatever the latest framework, latest stuff coming out. And I'll just say, I mean, I remain convinced that, you know, this digital stuff is just a great, great application of strategy, and the fundamentals of what it takes to create and capture value have not fundamentally shifted. I'll talk later about, though, what has changed. Going back to this, these kind of charts are always dangerous, right? You give these to your MBA students, and they can run off and make all kinds of positive feedback loops. And again, just making arrows on PowerPoint doesn't make it true. Every one of those arrows has to be is an assumption that could be validated. This is the kind of stuff that can make for interesting research. However, so you know, one of the big ones is, does machine learning really create value? Again, sometimes it's going to be overhyped, but there's no doubt if you go out and talk to people, machine learning is already creating some amazing value out there. Whether I'll give one example, not the sexiest or not the deepest one, but it makes the point really well. So if you're YouTube, how do you make money? You make money basically on advertising. So here's me. I'm thinking about, you know, going on vacation. I probably should have changed this. I should have done Portugal. But anyway, sorry. I'm going. I made a mistake. I was thinking maybe I wanted to go on vacation to Croatia. And so I did a search, and I watched this video from YouTube. What's critical for how much money YouTube makes off of my eyeballs? Well, what happens when the video say is done? There's two things. One is they're going to serve up an advertisement, and the greater the probability that I click on that advertisement, the more relevant it is to me, the more money they'll make. And so clearly, that's exactly the kind of thing. I mean, machine learning's not that sophisticated, but if you give it a ton of data, it can do amazing things, and it can figure out what ads to serve up. And then the second thing is, you want to keep me on your platform. What other videos should I recommend to keep you glued? Again, perfect type of application for machine learning. This is the kind of stuff that, you know, these big tech companies are seeing and why they're going in so headstrong. Great example of how being at the forefront gives you early information. Everyone knows this now. They knew it 3-4 years ago and have positioned themselves to lead. There you go. So I'd actually argue, and I think this is really important when we think about what's happening in traditional companies, that this, I'd argue, is fundamentally an age of strategy, more so in the past. So the news is not that strategy has changed, but the news is you actually suddenly have to be good at strategy. And I'd be a little bit tough, but again, I interact with a lot of, you know, pretty successful people, and I would just say a lot of them have been in pretty stable environments and you can be running big successful companies today and not in your career, certainly seeing major strategic shifts in your environment. So I talked earlier about BRICS. Again, emerging markets was a big deal. A lot of money to be made, but it wasn't that strategic, right? In the sense that if you were BMW or Mercedes and you were good at making cars, you had some big execution challenges to move to China, but still the product you made, a lot of the ways you competed, the way you distributed was not radically different. Again, so when I think about like the work INSEAD does, the training we did 5-10 years ago was all about leadership. It was all about just how do I motivate my people? How can I be authentic as a leader? We didn't really talk about where you were leading your people. But one of the things I've seen, at least at good companies when they develop their people, is more of a concern about purposeful leadership. Actually, how do we help, you know, people running senior companies think about how do you change, you know, what activities you do, who do you partner with, how do you compete? So the example here is clearly what's coming both with electric vehicles, but then with self-driving, is going to fundamentally challenge the whole nature of the automotive industry, right? Just little things like, key success factor in the automotive industry is all about the branding and how you appeal to the driver. When you don't drive your car, the way you think about competing is going to probably be very different, and that's something that people have not necessarily seen before. I think it gets better. So clearly, senior managers are a lot more sophisticated. I still remember talking to some of my former students in the late 90s when the music industry was disrupted. And so suddenly you had what type of people were running the music business in the 90s? It was typically people who are really good at relationships, right? If you ran a music business in 99, it's because you knew DJs and stars and agents. And I'd have teams of students who come back and say, okay, we're working at like BCG. We just presented like what's happening, how digital is going to change music. And we were literally cursed at by the executives and said, get those slides and data off there. There's just a huge shift in the type of talent you need running a company in a traditional setting versus one that's changing very fast. So I find that pretty interesting. Okay, so last idea, and then I'll take your questions, so I'd argue so far, big change is coming, doesn't really change strategy principles, but people have to get better at strategy. So what's changed? What I actually see changing, I think is really healthy, is the actual process by which people make strategy. So the classic approach was, you do a bunch of analysis of the environment, you formulate your strategy, and then you sit back and execute. And if you find it hard to analyze, that's okay. Bring in BCG or McKinsey, and they'll do the analysis for you. And that was kind of the way we thought about the world. There was always, always teaching this stuff, people would say, really? Can you really predict how the barriers to entry are going to, or rivalry is going to look in 5 years? A lot of pushback. But just gives a sense of what the issue is in this traditional approach to strategy. Dilbert, sort of classic modern reflection. And the engineer says, I'm thinking of getting into the strategic planning game, because as much as people might be cynical about strategy, it's always kind of high status. People want to do strategy. And he says, if I understand the job description, you basically hallucinate about the future, and then something different happens. And again, if you talk to, it's actually harder than that, as Dilbert points out. You also have to pretend it's useful. And that sounds really hard. And there's been a sense in which that game's always been played. People, whether it's in organizations or citizenship, no one likes all that uncertainty. You look to your leaders, whether it's in your organization or your society, for leaders who have a clear strategy. And as leaders, you're expected to deliver that. One of the things I think that's most healthy, though, in the last few years is under the weight of all the uncertainty coming from especially digital, but not only, people are just throwing in and saying, okay, forget it. I'm in strategy. The good people say, I'm going to have a vision for where I want to get to in 5 years, and I'm going to go much more agile. Again, part of the reason for the shift to agility is the uncertainty, and the other is that software is so important, right? When hardware gets so cheap, the key driver of value creation today is increasingly software, and software lends itself to agility. What's this? This is Amazon day one. Right, so that's the day they launched. And this is Amazon, at least my Amazon recently. How did they go from here to there, right? Was there Amazon 1.0, 2.0, 3.0? No, right? You didn't, if you blink, you'd never see it. Bit by bit, it evolves. Software lends itself incredibly to an agile approach where you put product out there, you get feedback, and you do this. And then similarly, this is Facebook. Well, here we go. Facebook, day one, the Facebook. There you go. This is, year two, early attempt at monetization with Zuckerberg calling up his summer camp and placing an ad with them from when he was a kid. And you can just run through. All this is on the internet. And again, it's all this agile. And so I'll skip over this for time, but you've probably heard about all this shift in IT to sort of agile type development. And I just make the same connection that similar shifts have happened in the way good companies think about strategy. You know it just doesn't work to get like massive binders from McKinsey or someone. It's much more of an agile process. Why? Because as soon as you start to execute, you get surprised. So the best idea in strategy today is, okay, do analysis. Yes, absolutely think about what's going on, but don't think that by sitting there and studying, you're going to cut through the complexity of the world. In most settings, the best practice is do something, get it out in the market, and learn from the feedback, and get surprised, learn fast. And so that's what I will. Maybe I'll say this. The challenge with these shifts, as you probably know, is not so much conceptually. This is not very complicated. It's not so much the processes, it's the culture that goes with it. So, deep in a lot of organizations, there's a risk aversion, a deep desire to please the boss. And again, that leads people to sit around and try and come up with the perfect strategy to present rather than to just get out there. So again, you'll see people putting things up like fail fast, fail often. I'm not sure that's the best slogan, but again, it's an attempt by senior leaders to change their culture. Not because in a traditional, it's like, oh, I win, I failed first. No, so anyway, for those, the one I like, actually, I have some former students who have scaled up a very big company in France called BlaBlaCar. The slogan they put on their walls, because again, even for a startup, you have to maintain this culture, is actually a good one, which is fail, learn, succeed. I'll probably end with, you can't underestimate the importance of learning in this environment. And that'll be my last thought to leave you with. Again, I think there have always been people who've told managers, hey, think about building a learning organization. There's always some truth to that. There's a lot of truth today, right? And there's a real alignment between individuals and companies that as individual employees, if you're not curious and constantly learning, your economic value is in danger. And similarly, for big companies, if they're not learning, both at the individual level, but also at the more corporate level, they're in trouble. And again, quite like this quote from Satya, the context is important. This is the day he's named CEO. So, all eyes on you, hundreds of thousands of employees. He sends an email introducing himself to the company. So you've got some, in terms of moments to shape a culture, that's an important one. You can send certain signals. You can see in the second paragraph, as he introduces himself, he chooses to emphasize the fact that he's a learner. And again, as I said, I think two things. It fits where strategy has gone over the last few years, but also fits a challenge that Microsoft had. Right? So Microsoft used to think about themselves as the smartest guys in the room, and they unfortunately were usually guys. And by the time Satya comes in, they'd lost that. The smartest talent was at Google, was at Facebook, was at Amazon, and especially Google, I'd say. And again, what Satya was trying to say is, well, let's position ourselves as the best learners in the room. And that's, I think, quite interesting, quite telling of where we are today. So again, that's, as I said, very broad level, how me, because grounded as an economist, but tries to make sense in kind of real time of what I'm seeing out there, what I'm hearing from different companies. And I really look forward to your questions and to discuss some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll open now for questions. Who wants to start? Oh, we have first one.
Well, yeah. So thank you, Peter. So what do you think is the major takeaway for universities and business schools and governments? So you see technology increasingly influencing all the way the businesses develop, succeed, and grow. So, for example, what I see is increasingly you need to understand. You always had to understand the business, but now understanding the business is a lot on how understanding how technology works. So, for example, I see a lot of people, IT engineers, they frequently say, so I would need help from someone that understands the business. But on the other hand, the guys that understand the business or general consultants, they need to understand what technology is. For example, everyone is talking about low code, but do people understand what low code means, what that means for the technology? Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll maybe 3 reactions to that. One, I think the key thrust of your comment I'd agree with, which is getting the business value out of these shifts requires the marrying of understanding the technology, but also understanding the business or the customers, right? And so that's a huge challenge inside companies, inside ecosystems, and so that's definitely a place to focus. And usually, when it doesn't work, the technology people just get seduced by the technology, and the people who understand the market feel threatened by the technology and see it as somehow IT's problem, and that doesn't work. Number 2, I don't know, certainly for business schools, which I know well, I see, again, dual challenges. One challenge is just for us as an economic entity, how do we best deliver on our mission to educate people? And clearly, there's online is part of it. Again, online education's a bit like retail, right? Retail, everyone got excited about digital. E-commerce, big excitement, big bust. But what happened is that bit by bit, every year, a couple % more went to retail, and in the long run, it's a big deal. Similarly in education, a bit later, what I see is it doesn't change overnight. Bit by bit, people get more comfortable with it and it shifts. But just to be reassuring, just like retail is now moving to very much a hybrid model, both online and physical, that's probably where education is going. It's going to be an interesting blend of online and person. Wow, government, and that was, I guess, the third thing. I'll just be super brief there. Again, in terms of competitiveness, this revolution is not going to sit in one place, obviously, right? It's too big to sit in Silicon Valley. It's moving out and about. Just as like originally, Detroit was a center for automotive, New York for finance, Chicago for other things. Same thing here. There's a huge opportunity for different locations to specialize. And it takes a number of things to get that right, as we heard earlier, education, but also policy. And so I can elaborate on that, but great question.
Yeah, so just very quickly, but do you think that, for example, should we have some core courses of technology teaching general managers, just like you consider finance to be a core course for managers?
Okay, great. So, I think I'd rather see it overall integrated. In the short run, we definitely, like at INSEAD, we would encourage each area to have an elective in technology, fintech or whatever, or digital social media marketing. I think that's more of a transitional state. I'd much rather see this just integrate everything that you do, where appropriate. I don't think you can teach a core course on operations or strategy without having these kind of examples in the course.
Another question?
Hi.
Hello.
I work in a digital company, and I'm surrounded by techies and engineers. And what I do, I'm a minority in that world.
Yeah.
There's a lot more of the techies and engineers. And you talked a lot about education, about automation and the future and sort of the industrial revolution tech side. If you were to fast forward 10 years, and you probably got this question a lot, but and you were thinking, I don't know if you have kids, but if you're thinking of your kids and their education, apart from the obvious techie and engineering fields and things like that, what would you invest in? What would you say would be the future of careers apart from that area of technology and engineering?
Yeah. Okay, well, so I do have 4 kids between 12 and 24, so I do think a bit about that. And I did manage to just recently steer my second daughter away from going in and becoming like an elementary school teacher and going into a London sort of ed tech setting. So that gives you some indication. Although my oldest daughter is sitting in a village in Gambia working on agriculture. I actually think that's great, being out in the real world and experiencing things that may go away. Anyway, so again, it depends on where you're at socioeconomically. So for kids who are in that sort of upper, have the possibility to, well-educated and stuff, there's huge opportunities, right? So this digital world is being created by, as you probably know, very smart people, very engaged, very creative people, meeting over pizzas in places, and there are different ways in. But you do want to consciously think about it. So easy way in would be going and doing tech. But one of my daughters happily did anthropology and moves in. You can do a whole set of things. My son wanted to do psychology. I said, hey, why don't you're good at math, add that on, because it's going to be a lot easier if you can combine math and psychology. So again, my view is 10, probably 20 years, we're going to be creating this digital world. Certainly we know for our best youth, there's amazing opportunities. I think more challenging is somebody who might have been on track to be a taxi driver 20 years ago. What do we say to them? But you didn't ask that question, so I will stick with my kids. Someone else may want to.
Mais alguém? Não estou a ver ninguém. No more questions?
Maybe just wait for the mic so everyone can hear.
I work in the health sector, and I have a huge doubt about how quickly we're going to move into the digital area, because it's a highly regulated market, and we see a lot of resistance, though we know that people need it and need more closer help. We see some moves, but very little, so I would like to see your view on that. Where are we moving? How fast?
So it does, again, it doesn't...
How to break down
so it doesn't surprise me that it's slow, because again, these are complex social systems, a lot of emotions around health. You'd expect it to be slow, but really, this slow? It's amazing, right? I'm just be honest, I'm surprised, given the cost pressures, right? You would have, and yet, just some of the difficulties, even in basic things like medical records, and it's not impressive. What else can I say? So I don't have, I would have thought the conditions had lined up for there to be more movement. And again, it's one of those reasons why I say this is going to be overall quite slow. Same in education, elementary, it's going to be slow. Again, I think what can be interesting sometimes, again, certainly what's interesting also in smaller countries, is there can be advantages in smaller, well-run countries in terms of moving on this stuff. And so you do need to see some beacons, some people who really say, hey, let's be known for this. And again, I think it's not the most obvious place to have export markets, but I would still think for certain countries, if you get good at digital health, it will come eventually, and there is a long-term play there. Someone should tackle it.
Mais alguma pergunta?
Just a last one would be, it's going to be a huge, one of the biggest breakthroughs in machine learning is image recognition. So let's find out, all of the radiology type stuff can be done not only cheaper, but frankly much better. And if systems cannot, in a timely way, adapt to that, we've really got a problem. Because again, they're like fundamental health outcomes that'll be compromised if we don't use this technology. And again, I think that would be one of several places to maybe really focus if you want to shift that system.
We have two more questions, one here and one there.
Just one question. You just mentioned
Oh yeah, very good. Yeah, sorry.
fintech.
Yeah.
How do you see the financial world moving in the next few years? I mean, we see with the big companies, Googles and others, starting to move. We see some underdeveloped countries with very sophisticated delivery systems on the financial side. So how do you perceive that evolution?
So sort of definitely in between. So clearly, financial markets have a lot of brakes on them, a lot of complexity. So at a very high level, they're not going to move like travel, consumer, but there's a lot more dynamism and will somehow to move than, say, health. So I'm pretty impressed with how sort of some of the big financial players are definitely waking up, shifting their culture, bringing in talent, sort of consciously going out to try and compete with big tech. You start to see some, really interesting things coming out of some of the banks, embracing the technology. And again, I'll say the other key thing you want to see, which I think we're starting to see in financial services, is the ability for big players to work with small players. So if you think about, like, say, the successful dynamism in pharmaceuticals, it largely came out of biotech because they eventually figured out big pharmaceuticals should do what they do well, which is registering, distributing drugs, and they can outsource a lot of the R&D to some smaller players. And over time, they figured out how to do that. I think financial services is an interesting place to do that. Again, a lot of the small fintech players are never going to figure out all the regulation stuff. A lot of the big banks are never going to deeply become tech companies. So I think that sort of complementary ecosystem that's emerging in some places is favorable. And that's certainly an area that I would focus on if I was working in that space.
Uiteindelijk of zo. Zet je voor microfoon.
It's me? Or?
Yeah, you've got the microphone, so I think that gives you...
Very interesting. You have a slide where you show how fast machine learning is growing.
Yeah.
And then your last slide is Microsoft's CEO talking about his curiosity and how evolved he is in learning. Can you elaborate a bit more on these two facets?
Yeah. Okay, well, so one thing is, where to begin? Again, they're somewhat separate, but maybe one thing to say is indeed, there's a huge break. The breakthrough in machine learning is instead of, it used to be we would give machines data and programs and they'd give us output. Today, we give machines data and output. Like, this is what people did, and the machines learn what the code is. So you might think, oh, great, as humans, we don't have to learn. I think the first thing to realize is the learning that those machines do is incredibly narrow. So there's a piece that's going to be very much dominated by machines, but for decades, there's a huge amount of learning that has to be done by humans and human systems. I'm still working closely with Microsoft. One thing they're doing right now is he's just going to say, I don't know if I should say this, but anyway, they're going to say, like, all Microsoft employees have to go deep on technical training, right? So he's, as much as he's building up machine learning, he's saying, if, as a company, and they have a good position in this, we're going to get the value out, we not only need the technology, but we need our people to learn and go deeper. And so I still see him pushing on those together. Again, I see them as complements, at least in the medium term.
One last.
Yeah, okay, one last.
Hello. I can't resist asking about data protection regulation, and I just wanted to hear your sort of How do you think different blocs are reacting to it? And I'm thinking about Europe, US, and China. And in a more provocative way, I'm thinking if we really should misbehave if there's too much data protection. I'm just to make my point clear, I think it can sort of lower utility creation, it can risk creating less transparency, it can lower your ability to even scrutinize some of the big players you were talking about. And also it gets the potential of you can get this growth potential very trapped in very old problems like bureaucracies and incentives within organizations and who decides on what. So I just wanted to hear how different blocs are dealing with this.
Well, so I'll try and be I'll be a little bit positive on the European angle, while acknowledging what you say, which is there's always risks in regulation, especially early on with moving technologies. This could hamper in some ways some of the things you might like to do around AI. Clearly, as you probably know, the Chinese are much more wide open, and that clearly gives them an advantage. And the Americans are kind of stumbling and clueless because their system is dysfunctional right now. So they'll just expect the status quo. The reason I think I'd still have some positive views on what the Europeans are doing is there's this other big, maybe it's a good thing to end on, there's this other big issue which is around trust, right? And there, everyone will talk about there's this trust deficit, and clearly if you don't if you just leave these tech companies fully unregulated, there's a real sense in which the system can break, the trust can go away, and that'll create a lot more problems. So if government is not stepping in and finding ways to create new institutions, it's not going to work. Again, I think I would hope that the Europeans would take a more agile approach. Okay, they put something out there. I hope they understand that it's not going to go completely according to plans. How are you thinking about a more agile approach to regulation in this space is hugely important. So that's pretty positive on Europe. On the negative side, what I see is it's a lot easier to do that at a small national level. Obviously, INSEAD, we're active in UAE and Singapore. Pretty impressive what you can do in a small, well-run country to deal with this. Much harder to do at the US or European level. So we'll see how that plays out. I think the advantage of the Chinese is they, to some extent, combine some of the advantages of a sort of unitary actor, but with scale. So obviously, we all have to watch that space. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. I thought I was done, but that's all right.
As a strategist, what is the killing threat to INSEAD in the near future?
Nothing. No, it's like, it doesn't. Okay, what keeps? Strategy always it's a mix of opportunity and threat. So for me, I see the opportunity as tech for INSEAD. Tech's gone global. So it's no longer just in one place. There's a huge need to build bridges between what's happening in Paris and Shanghai and Singapore and Dubai. And so I think the opportunity for INSEAD is to do that. The weaknesses that we have to address are the broader footprint. So right now we're busy setting up a small facility in San Francisco because you still, even as things move out of the US, it's going to be really helpful to be duper in the US. And I'm going to be spending much of November in China trying to figure out what we do there because we're not nearly active enough given what's coming. I think in general for Europeans, this ability to bridge, it's going to be moving, but this clash between between the US and China, you can tell it's on my mind, is potentially opens up some interesting opportunities for some European enterprises, but it's pretty tortuous. So we have to really think carefully about how we navigate this big shift between these two powers. That's where I'll end.
You want to? No. Okay, further. No, speak. No, I think we are over the questions.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciated that.
Peter.
Peter Zemsky allowed me to express on the behalf of the Foundation, and I believe the entire audience, to express our gratitude to honor in this way, with your knowledge and with your energy, the memory of António Borges. And I think this is the best way to end our journey of economy and competitiveness in this way, the lecture. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, é também desta forma, com esta lecture, que estamos a chegar ao fim das nossas jornadas de economia e competitividade. Passámos um dia muito cheio e espero também que muito útil para todos vós. E queria também, por isso, aproveitar esta oportunidade para começar por agradecer à doutora Isabel Borges e à sua família, ao carinho e à presença do professor Diogo Lucena, mas também ao professor Fernando Alexandre, que é, como sabem, consultor da área de Economia da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos e que liderou este conteúdo científico deste dia que passámos aqui juntos, também em conjunto com os coordenadores dos 3 estudos hoje aqui apresentados e discutidos. Agradeço também por isso, em nome da Fundação, a dedicação da equipa que tornou possível este evento, liderado pela minha colega Mónica Vieira e composta pelo Richard Frois e pela Clara Valadas Preto. O dia vai longo e, portanto, também não queria deixar, não vos queria deixar ir embora sem partilhar convosco os nossos próximos pontos de encontro, o mesmo é dizer, as nossas próximas iniciativas. Desculpem aproveitar estes últimos minutos para o fazer. Mas nós, na próxima semana, vamos apresentar em Bruxelas o retrato de Portugal na Europa. Um estudo exaustivo e comparativo de Portugal no contexto dos 28 países da União Europeia. Fazemos-lo na delegação da REPER em Bruxelas, em bilingue, e também porque temos o grato prazer de receber do Parlamento Europeu, na próxima semana, o Prémio de Cidadão Europeu, a Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. A 15 de outubro vamos apresentar mais um estudo acompanhado e liderado pelo meu colega Gonçalo Matias, diretor científico da Fundação, sobre o Orçamento de Estado. Orçamento, economia e democracia são as linhas motoras deste estudo que vamos apresentar. E, por fim, entre 31 de outubro e 23 de novembro, vamos levar a 5 cidades do país, Aveiro, Viseu, Coimbra, Funchal e Lisboa, aquela que é já uma jornada que nos acompanha anualmente, que é o mês da educação e da ciência. Vamos desdobrar-nos em iniciativas, em colóquios, em estudos, em conferências, não abandonando nunca uma daquelas que consideramos ser uma das nossas bandeiras e temas de charneira, a educação e a ciência. São, por isso, a partir de agora e sempre, muito bem-vindos. Muito obrigado por terem passado este dia connosco.
Obrigado.